19th-century China, Part 3, 1875 to 1900. The stipulation that China allow Christian missionaries into its interior was one of the most important provisions of the treaties it signed at the end of the Second Opium War. While often the missionaries provided humanitarian assistance to the Chinese population, their presence was also a source of friction. Often, missionaries openly criticized Chinese culture. Secondly, because they were legally protected by the treaties, they became associated with imperialism in the minds of some Chinese. Finally, this legal protection also extended to their converts, who, on some occasions, abused their privileges in disputes with other Chinese. On the other side, Confucian elites often felt threatened by the emergence of a rival source of authority in their regions. They often gave credence to wild rumors about the scandalous deeds of Christians like rape, sexual deviance, cannibalism, and others. One of the earliest manifestations of violence was the Tianjin massacre in 1870. The disturbance started over Christians having built a church on the site of a former temple. Passions were further inflamed by false rumors that Christians were abducting and murdering children. In the riots that ensued, 18 foreigners were killed. Not wishing to anger the Western powers, the Qing government immediately rebuilt the church, executed those involved, and paid large sums of money to the victims' families. There were other cases of violence throughout China as well. Aside from going out to convert the Chinese to their faith, missionaries also focused their efforts on improving the lives of everyday people and made important contributions to Chinese society. Missionaries produced a lot of printed materials, some of which was religious, like the Bible. Others dealt with subjects like history, science, or industry, and thus they played a major role in exposing the Chinese to Western culture. Likewise, missionaries also established schools to spread the faith, but the curriculum also included English education and Western subjects. These schools were unusual in China in that they accepted the children of the poor and included both male and female students. Missionaries also helped introduce Western medicine into China, building some of the country's first hospitals. Finally, missionaries were active in speaking out against aspects of Chinese society they perceived to be immoral, like foot binding and prostitution. After a period of relative peace with the Western powers, after the Second Opium War, a new round of conflict emerged at the end of the 1870s. In 1875, for instance, a British official was killed by local tribes in Yunnan province while exploring southern China. The murder prompted outrage on the part of the British and resulted in the Chinese court writing a letter of apology to Queen Victoria and paying a large sum in compensation to the man's family. Russia, too, in the north, began to encroach on Chinese territory in Manchuria. Much more serious was the conflict with France over Vietnam. For centuries, Vietnam had been a tributary state of China. Since the early 19th century, the French had been gradually extending their control over the southern part of Vietnam, which had been ceded to it in 1862. As the French began to put pressure on the northern kingdom of Vietnam, the king appealed to China for assistance. The resulting war, which broke out in 1884, saw the French resoundingly defeat the newly constructed Chinese Navy, destroying its new modern shipyard, threatening Shanghai, and prompting the Qing to back down. The resulting treaty ceded Vietnam and saw the French add Laos and Cambodia as well. The British, in turn, moved into Burma, leaving only Thailand as a buffer between the two. China's greatest adversary would not come from the shores of a far-off continent, but from its former pupil, Japan. Since its forced opening in 1854 by the United States and other Western powers, Japan had modernized very rapidly. While this is a story that will be examined more fully in another lecture, its rise directly impacted China. Like the European powers, Japan saw territories outside its borders. In the 1870s, it set its ambitions on the Kingdom of Korea. Since China had long considered Korea to be a tributary vassal, they objected strongly. The two sides were able to reach an uneasy power-sharing agreement for several decades. The agreement broke down in 1895 because of internal Korean turmoil, and the two sides went to war. The Sino-Japanese War was a giant mismatch on paper. For over millennia, Japan had been the junior partner in the relationship, and China had 8 times the population of Japan. However, Japan had more thoroughly modernized, giving it an advantage. Japan was victorious on all fronts. On the ground, they defeated the Chinese in Seoul and soon marched into northern China. Meanwhile, its navy nearly destroyed the northern Chinese navy. In the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, China agreed to relinquish its claims over Korea, pay an indemnity, cede the island of Taiwan, and grant Japan the right to build factories in China itself. The Chinese were shocked, having lost the war to what they regarded as a weak and insignificant neighbor. For the astute in China, it proved once and for all that the world had changed and that it needed to modernize. Internationally, it was a disaster. It showed that China was a weak and faltering giant ripe for the taking. The Chinese defeat by Japan then opened the floodgates for foreign powers to rush in and begin to carve up China into spheres of influence. These semi-colonial claims gave the imperial power economic priority in the area. Germany claimed Shandong. Russia began to colonize Manchuria. Britain claimed the Yangtze Valley. Fujian went to Japan, and France claimed the southeast of China. The metaphor used for the dismemberment of China was carving up the melon. The U.S. made no special claims regarding China and feared it might be economically locked out of China. So, in the midst of all this, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay sent out a letter affirming the U.S.'s commitment to free trade and Chinese territorial integrity. This policy became known as the Open Door Policy. Faced with the loss of territorial sovereignty and military and economic domination by foreigners, a group of reformers set about trying to radically change China. Their primary target was the Qing, whom they despised for being too weak and too corrupt. The movement also saw proto-nationalism. This movement fostered a personal attachment to China on the part of its inhabitants and advocated for direct involvement in the political process. The leading reformer was Kang Yu-wei. Kang took an unorthodox view of Confucius, arguing that the sage was a believer in changing with the times. This imaginative reinterpretation allowed Kang to give a classical justification for his desire to modernize. He won the ear of the young emperor Guangxu to his philosophy. In 1898, the emperor began a series of reforms. These included new civil service exams, which evaluated students on their ability to solve practical problems and not on their knowledge of the classics. He began a new department of commerce and industry to develop China's manufacturing, railways, and banking. He also proposed reforms to modernize education along with military reforms. Had they been allowed to continue, these reforms would have radically altered China. The speed at which the changes were occurring alarmed court conservatives. Guangxu's powers were limited, in fact. His aunt, the Empress Dowager Cixi, had been the real power in China since the 1860s. In the summer of 1898, with the help of court conservatives, she launched a coup against her nephew, imprisoning him on an island and executing and exiling top reformers. Thus, the 100 Days reform came to an abrupt end. The late 1890s were the high point of imperial expansion into China. Foreign powers were making land grabs and demanding concessions. Missionaries continued to actively proselytize in China, leading to disputes and violence. The areas around Shandong, poor even in good times, had recently suffered severe floods and drought. For many peasants, the source of their problems seemed clear. Foreigners were to blame for their woes. Their armies were devouring the country, while their missionaries enraged China's native gods, causing natural disasters. Some peasants began to organize themselves into semi-religious organizations. They demanded the expulsion of foreigners. Devoted to a martial arts regimen, they called themselves the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Westerners called them the Boxers. In the late 1890s, the Boxers began attacking Western symbols, railroad tracks, telegraph lines, as well as foreign missionaries and their Chinese converts. In normal circumstances, the court took a dim view toward peasant disturbances. But coming off the 100 Days reform debacle and facing increasing foreign domination, the Empress Dowager Cixi saw a potential ally in the Boxers. Rather than suppressing the movement, Cixi encouraged it. With the tacit support of the imperial court, the center of the Boxer movement migrated to Beijing. In early June of 1900, the Boxers severed train and telegraph lines to the capital, killed several diplomats, and surrounded and besieged the foreign diplomatic quarters. Foreign governments swiftly responded to the threat to their nationals. Within weeks, expeditionary forces had landed, and an 8-nation coalition was marching on Beijing. On the 21st of June, Cixi called for an all-out war. By August of 1900, the 8-nation army had reached Beijing, liberating the diplomats and forcing Cixi to flee. In 1901, the Boxer Protocol was signed. It stipulated the execution of the Boxer leaders, forbid the importation of arms into China for 2 years, and allowed for a permanent foreign military presence in China. It also mandated that the Chinese pay an enormous sum in reparations to the nations affected by the rebellion. The sum was so large that the Chinese were unable to pay it off until 1940. So then, As the 19th century drew to a close, China had been repeatedly humbled militarily. She was being carved up by foreigners. Debt now threatened to crush her, and she was facing a crisis in leadership.